morning. I'm particularly pleased to see so many old friends and colleagues in the audience before me. I always think it's important at an event such as this to have a sense of history. It's impossible to understand the present day unless we go back and examine how history has unfolded. That exactly 70 years ago, the Second World War was beginning to take shape. And indeed, exactly 70 years ago today, on the 11th of September 1939, Time magazine, which has already been mentioned, marked the outbreak of the Second World War with a series of interesting reports. One of these included an evocative assessment of the implications of the Second World War for the Mediterranean, which Time magazine referred to as the great tideless embattled sea of antiquity. And according to Time, the Mediterranean was a decisive theatre of war, but it was also a maze of variables, which was crisscrossed with conflicting currents. Focusing on the east of the Mediterranean, Time magazine added that the currents in the east were marked by the rush of opposing interests, and they were threatened by a net of variables, each as dangerous, each as explosive as a floating mine. And it's tempting 70 years later to say that nothing in substance has changed. That description of the Mediterranean and the east of the Mediterranean is as valid today as it was back then. It's also rather sobering to recall that during the Second World War, up to 600 Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, Armenians, Maronites and Latins were killed in action, including 200 or so missing presumed dead. As the Allies prepare to commemorate the 70th anniversaries of the great battles of the Second World War, let us hope that the contribution of those servicemen will be properly acknowledged. More to the point, so far as this conference is concerned, the Cypriot contribution to the Allied war effort highlights a fundamental point. When the chips are down and when Western values are at risk, Western interests are best served if the island of Cyprus is united, not just politically, but in the willingness of its citizens to cooperate with the West in defence of those values. The West is a loose association, a loose grouping of states which have shared values. The European Union is a representative, I submit, of the West. The European Union, according to its treaty, is founded on liberty, democracy, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law, principles which are common to the EU member states, including the Republic of Cyprus. And as I always emphasise to my students, we in this hall and in the UK are beneficiaries of one of the most cherished of human rights, the qualified right to freedom of expression within the law. All of us today will be exercising that fundamental human right. Ray has asked me to be provocative. I shall be provocative. And I shall be provocative in a way that I think reflects that cherished right to freedom of expression. And I shall be provocative without fear of being arrested by the authorities, without fear of being thrown into jail by the courts, and without fear of being ostracised by society. That's because the Republic of Cyprus today, at least in the government-controlled areas, has been transformed into a Western liberal democracy which espouses and protects fundamental freedoms and the rule of law. And I'm reminded here of the great observation of Adlai Stevenson, the American politician who unsuccessfully ran for the presidency. According to Adlai Stevenson, a free society is one where it is safe to be unpopular. And by the end of my 45 minute or so contribution, I may be unpopular in some parts of this room, but I'm going to exercise my human right to freedom of expression in that regard. My objective this morning, ladies and gentlemen, is threefold. The details are set out in the draft paper that you have in front of you, or you should have in front of you. If you don't, you can collect a copy outside later. But my three objectives are, firstly, to look at the history of the Republic of Cyprus and highlight the degree to which it has been transformed from a republic that was in the non-aligned movement and not really considered part of Europe, let alone the West, into a unique pillar of the West and of Western values. It's not yet a perfect pillar, but it's very much, I would submit, a pillar of the West. My second objective is to draw attention to this so-called crescent of crisis and the kaleidoscope of conflict, two phrases which have entered the lexicon of international relations, and consider what sort of role Cyprus already performs and what role it may perform in the future. And in the third and final part of my talk, I'm going to grapple with the elephant in the room, the Cyprus question, and submit to you that the present negotiations are inappropriate, to say the least. I'll save my provocative phrases for later on that point. Let's begin, therefore, with the westerly, the transition of the Republic of Cyprus from a non-aligned state into a unique pillar of the West. I thought it was appropriate to begin with a bit of literature, from Lawrence Durrell. In Bitter Lemons, the magnificent book he wrote recording his experiences on the island, he describes his journey in 1953 from Venice to Cyprus. And he remarks in a wonderful passage, when he arrived in Cyprus, it was time to say goodbye to Europe. That was the attitude of the 1950s. Cyprus wasn't really part of Europe. It was close to Europe, yeah, of course it was. Close to Europe, but it wasn't really part of Europe. And I'm afraid the colonial period was very much contributed to that perception. Hence, as we all know, and I'm not going to go into the detailed history, hence the failure in the post-war period to apply democratic principles properly to this island. That, of course, gave rise to the troubles of the 50s and the settlement of 1959-60, which allowed 3 NATO allies to maintain control of this island, but at the same time it established a Republic of Cyprus that was not put into the NATO alliance. And that's quite important for my thesis. It's important for my thesis because back in 1959, the Greek and Turkish governments considered seriously, and indeed they agreed in principle, that the Republic of Cyprus should join the NATO alliance. And for various reasons, the idea was kicked into Dutch, and the Republic was established in 1960 as a state outside the framework of NATO. And in 1961, the first president of the Republic, Archbishop Malgarios, applied to the non-aligned movement and became a member of the non-aligned movement. And this, I'm not going to go into any details here, this created the perception, or rather underlined the perception in certain circles in Washington in particular, that the Republic of Cyprus was not part of the West. If you look at the declassified papers of the United States administration from the period, you can encounter this wonderful poem written by Samuel E. Belk, who worked in the Eisenhower administration. This is what he said in December 1959 in a poem. Cyprus lying in the sea, could your future gloomier be? Divided and torn from east to west, what a mess. It's easy to speak with hindsight, but in hindsight, was it the best decision for the Republic to join the non-aligned movement and cavort with characters such as Castro, Nasser, Nkrumah, Sukarno and Tito? I know here the consensus in the 60s and 70s was that was a good idea. But in hindsight, if you understand the realpolitik of the period and if you understand American thinking, perhaps in my view that wasn't a wise idea. The point is, thank you, the point that can you hear me now? Could you hear me earlier?
Yes.
The point is that the non-aligned movement, to all intents and purposes, was a third world alliance which cut little teeth in the international environment. There was no equivalent in the non-aligned movement of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. There was no self-defense mechanism. So when crisis erupts, the non-aligned movement is incapable of springing to your defence. And we all know what happened in the immediate post-1960 period. Internal tensions erupted in the 60s, and those internal tensions gave rise to military intervention from Turkey, initially in 1964, and then with the fully fledged invasion in 1974. I'm not going to go into the details. The point is that the invasion and partition of the Republic in 1974 was partly a consequence of the isolated, fragile status of the Republic of Cyprus within the international system. It was isolated, caught between the East and the West, with friends in the non-aligned movement who had no power and no ability to spring to the Republic's defence. What are the lessons, therefore, from that pre-1974 period? Well, there are various ones I'm going to just single out. The first one is that the government and citizens of the Republic of Cyprus really have to treat the world as it is rather than as they would wish it to be. Secondly, they need to fully appreciate the geopolitical framework of which their homeland forms part. Thirdly, they need to take appropriate decisions to protect their interests, and they must never be too insular. To quote what was said earlier, you need to look over the horizon and not just look at what goes on within the parameters of this island. But perhaps most significantly of all, the government and citizens of the Republic, in my view, need to understand that for any ship of state, if I can use a naval analogy, for any ship of state to pass through the dangerous waters of international relations, it needs shrewd captaincy, together with a united, disciplined crew, which is on the lookout for rocks which are visible, as well as icebergs which are not. And given the presence of so many risks, it's sometimes safer for a small ship to form part of a formidable, powerful flotilla, rather than try and make its own way on its own. So in 1974, the Republic found itself shipwrecked, isolated with very few friends around the world, a republic that had been torn in two, its northern areas occupied militarily, its populations demographically split asunder, and pretty much in a very bad place. So that was the position in 74. Now let's just move forward since 1974 and see what's happened. In that post-1974 period, the Republic, by hook or by crook, has managed to progress from being a de facto partitioned, shipwrecked state into a modern liberal democracy with a flawed but nonetheless functioning democratic political system and membership of the European Union. This is of profound importance to the West and to this Republic, and I don't think it's been fully realised in either the West or the Republic that this transition has happened. And I don't think the implications in this place in particular have been fully grasped. The Republic of Cyprus is now part of the West. Even though I live in England, I watch RIC, the Cyprus Broadcasting Service, and its political programmes, and I often hear politicians talking about the West as if it's some organisation or body over there. The Republic is part of the West, and it's something that people here need to grasp. Western values are essentially Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean values. Many of those concepts I referred to earlier, democracy and the rule of law, have their philosophical origins in ancient Athens. These are not alien concepts, these are not alien values. These are values that are inextricably part of the culture and the framework, and I would add the mindset of the people in this part of the world. So that is of fundamental importance and needs to be grasped. And by the same token, I would add that in the West, we don't often regard the Republic of Cyprus as part of the West. Often, when you read international relations articles, there's a sort of a sentence mentioned in which Cyprus is mentioned. It is often mentioned in the context of the Cyprus question or as an offshoot of Turkey or as part of the Middle East. It may be part of the Middle East, as I would put it, an island off the Middle East. But it's also inextricably part of the West. And there needs to therefore be a mindset change of gear, I would submit, both in the West and in that part of the West that is known as the Republic of Cyprus. Now let's just go back to the history. In that post-74 period, the Republic of Cyprus had a choice, as it were. It could, had the circumstances been different, have chosen the path of, say, the Palestinians after the 1948 or 1967, or indeed 1973 Middle Eastern wars. The Republic could have embarked upon a military campaign, either on an official basis or using paramilitary forces. It could have engaged in hijacking of aircraft and all those other dreadful things that we saw in the 70s and 80s in a different context. The Republic and its citizens chose not to go down that path. Arguably, they didn't have the choice of doing it. But the fact is, I don't even think it came into anyone's mind to pursue that approach. They chose the path of cooperation with the West, even though they'd been let down badly by the British in particular and by the Americans. So they chose the path of cooperation with the West. They chose to shun confrontation, and they chose to shun any form of violence with a view to securing political objectives. In fact, as far as I can see, the last episode of that sort of violence here in Cyprus occurred with the assassination of the US ambassador in August 1974, but that was at the height of the Troubles. Since then, violence has not formed part of the agenda of the Republic or its citizens. Now, this path of cooperation has got, as far as I can see, as an outsider looking in and with only limited access to official documents and other materials. As far as I can see, this path of cooperation has operated on two levels. On the softer level, there are things such as educational links between the Republic and the West. As a lawyer, I think I'm obliged to say this, that the legal links between the Republic and the UK are profound. According to the Cyprus Bar Association, as many as 64% of registered lawyers in the Republic studied law or qualified as lawyers in England before coming back to the Republic to practice law. And that speaks volumes for the quality of legal education in the UK. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it also says something about the common law legacy of colonialism, and it also says something about the underlying, how can I put this, love-hate relationship between the Republic and its citizens and the United Kingdom. So that, on one level, there are cultural, educational, trade and other links that have been built up between the Republic and the UK. But on another level, there's this path of cooperation, as I put it, has also affected the military sphere, which is something I've written about extensively in different contexts. But in that post-1974 period, the Republic remained a non-aligned member, but at the same time, it offered its territory to Western military forces at certain times. A good example occurred in the post-74 period with the U-2s. The Republic of Cyprus did not object to the continuing presence of American U-2 aircraft at Agrodir. In 1982, when the Lebanon crisis erupted, or one of the many Lebanon crises erupted, the Republic put its territory at the disposal of US Marines and other US forces. Larnaca Airport was used, I think Limassol Port was used, as well as the SPAs. They could have said to the Americans, no, sorry, in view of what you did in '74, we're not going to cooperate. But they chose to cooperate. They made a decision back then under President Yugoslavia to cooperate, and the Lebanon operation was facilitated by the use of both the Republic and the SPAs. With regard to the SPAs, the Republic, as far as I can tell, has maintained a policy of cooperation with the SBAs. They may not have been, in that post-74 period, enthusiastic about the continued British presence, but they hadn't put any, as far as I can see, any major obstacles in the path of the British, and they've tried to cooperate so far as possible with them. So that policy of cooperation with the West in that period in the 70s and 80s is quite profound. But the turning point, ladies and gentlemen, the turning point I would submit, just looking at the post-74 history, perhaps came in 1990. In 1990, just as the Berlin Wall's dust was beginning to settle and as the Cold War was beginning to end, two events happened of profound significance to the orientation of the Republic of Cyprus from the east to the from the non-aligned movement to the west. Perhaps I'll just show you a map of the Cold War Europe at the time. In 1990, the Republic of Cyprus, in July of that year, submitted its formal application to join the European Economic Community, as the EU was then known. So July 1990 was the application made to the EEC. That was a bold, astute and ultimately successful move, which signalled that the Republic was heading in a westerly direction. They didn't make any application to NATO, but they made an application to the European Union. And given the history of the European Union and its symbolic status as a pillar of the West, that was a profound significance which ultimately bore fruit 14 years later. The other thing that happened in 1990 was in August, and I was here when it happened, having a summer holiday. The Iraqis invaded and occupied Kuwait, and the British particularly used their sovereign base areas to go in support of the Kuwaitis. Initially, what the Americans called Desert Shield and then Desert Storm. The Republic could have kicked up a fuss, as they did in 1973 when the Americans used, or tried to use, and was prevented by Heath, tried to use the SBAs in support of Israel. The Republic of Cyprus did not kick up a fuss. So the British were able to send in hundreds of aircraft into Abu Dhabi and send their forces to and from the Gulf without any obstacles put in their path by the Republic. Now that may have been partly because the operation to the Gulf had UN support, but nonetheless it was a reflection of how the Republic was moving away from this sort of non-aligned mindset that had coloured its policies in the 60s and 70s. So in my view, 1990 is quite critical. 3 years later, we had the publication in Foreign Affairs of that historic article by Samuel P. Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. Now Huntington, I don't think spent much time thinking about Cyprus, or let alone writing about it, although Cyprus does crop up in both his article and his subsequent book on the subject. Now let's just remind ourselves what Huntington said back in 1993. He argued that as the Cold War was ending, world politics is entering a new phase. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future. The central axis in world politics in the future is likely to be the conflict between the West and the rest, and the responses of non-Western civilizations to Western power and values. Now, Huntington proceeded to identify 7 or 8 major civilizations, including the Western, Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and, as he put it, possibly African. Now, where did the Republic of Cyprus fall in this categorization articulated by Huntington back in 1993? Was it an integral part of the Western civilization? Was it an integral part of the Slavic Orthodox civilization? Was it part of the Islamic civilization? Or was it one of the so-called torn countries, a phrase that Huntington used in that article? Now, Huntington reached the view back in 1993 that the Republic of Cyprus, or Cyprus as he put it, was part of the Slavic Orthodox civilization. looking back on the history, I would probably argue that was an inappropriate depiction on Huntington's terms, if we accept Huntington's terms. It's perhaps more accurate to say that in the 1990s, the Republic of Cyprus was still a torn country. It had a foot in more than one civilizational camp. It was a torn country in the sense that it was also historically part of the Ottoman Empire, and thus the Renaissance and many of the other developments of Western Europe had bypassed it. And I hope you can see where I'm getting at here. This was the mindset of the 1990s, as the Balkans were set ablaze. But the point is, Huntington reflected, I think, American thinking at the time. The Republic was not part of the West. It was part of the Slavic Orthodox bloc, or at best a torn country. Things, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest you have changed since 1993. And what's changed in particular since 1993 is the accession of the Republic of Cyprus to the European Union. The Republic now, I would argue, in Huntington's terms, if one accepts Huntington's terms, is indeed part of the Western civilization. It is a modern liberal democracy, it has by and large a free market economy, it espouses and cherishes Western values, and it is, to all intents and purposes, a part of the West, as I defined it earlier. It still has some of the trappings of the so-called torn country syndrome, and it still has the trappings of what Huntington described as the kin country syndrome. If you watch the Eurovision Song Contest, and the voting patterns at the end of the Eurovision contest, that's the only thing I watch in the Eurovision Song Contest. The songs are generally dreadful. The Republic of Cyprus always grants 12 points to Greece, however good or bad the song is. And they also often gives 12 high marks to Armenia or other Orthodox countries, and that's a reflection of this sort of kin country syndrome. The serious point though is that in substance the Republic has become part of the West. That's my argument, subject to these lingering attachments to Orthodoxy and, at least in the occupied areas, to Islam. Now let's move on a bit, and I'm conscious of the time. And let's look at the period since 2001 onwards and try and bring this story up to date. Well, what's happened since 2001 is that the Republic of Cyprus, without much fanfare, without actually making a fuss about it, without even trying to, as far as I can see, gain too many political or financial rewards, has essentially put its territory at the disposal of Western and primarily US and UK military forces in connection with Iraq and Afghanistan. That is of fundamental importance, and yet I don't think too many people on this Republic have gained any political or financial dividends from it. In the immediate aftermath of September the 11th, 2001, which of course occurred exactly 8 years ago today, more than 2,700 people were killed in devastating circumstances. And before the dust had time to settle at the three crash sites, the attention turned to Afghanistan, the Taliban, and Osama bin Laden. That's quite clear, not just from the media reports, but from the diaries of, for example, Alistair Campbell, who was the Prime Minister's press spokesman in the UK at the time. Alistair Campbell's diaries reveal that Tony Blair had spent the previous summer reading the Quran, which I thought was quite an interesting little detail. But the point is that, as we all know, the neocons in America seized their moment. And those who accepted the Huntington thesis had a field day. They saw this as the apotheosis of the Huntington vision. I was rather struck by an article in the Jerusalem Post on the 24th of September, which seemed to encapsulate this train of thought. This is what an opinion piece said in the Jerusalem Post on the 21st of September 2001. It's beginning to sink in that what happened on September the 11th was not a single terrorist attack on a single country, but the Pearl Harbor of Islamism in its war against the West. In 1941, Americans were surprised by the Japanese attack, but at least they knew what and where Japan was. In retrospect, the great defeated isms of the last century, Nazism and communism, are well understood. Now we are groping for an understanding of the new ism that has declared war on us. how the neocons seized their moment, America went into Afghanistan, or still is today, and went into Iraq. The point is, and it was little reported at the time, the Republic of Cyprus opened its airspace and territory to the United States, and from what little information we have in the public domain, it's pretty clear that this was not a token gesture. The Americans seized the opportunity to make use of the airspace and territory of the Republic of Cyprus. And indeed, in 2002, I understand that the US and the Republic signed a mutual legal assistance treaty in relation to the legal and commercial aspects of the so-called global war on terror. But also, there was an agreement made in connection, a separate agreement made in connection with cooperative efforts in response to terrorism, humanitarian assistance, US Navy port visits, US aircraft landings, and other agreed activities. In other words, the Republic of Cyprus in 2001 and 2002 effectively opened its territory to US military forces. And that's a profound development if you think about the non-aligned history of the Republic. As a consequence of that, we now know the American forces used the Republic and the SPAs, of course. The British used the Republic and the SPAs, of course. And the invasion of Iraq took place. This isn't the place to go into the pros and cons of the invasion of Iraq. For what it's worth, I was on that demonstration in London in February 2003, demonstrating against the forthcoming war. I could see it was all going to go pear-shaped like all those others. We were ignored. That's another story. The point is, the Republic of Cyprus was there for the West to use, and the West, in the form of the US and the UK, used the Republic. What did the Republic gain in return? You're in a better position to know than I am. Did it gain any financial assistance? I don't know.
The Annan Plan.
They were given the Annan Plan. And I cannot understand the mindset in both Washington and London. Here you are, you have a territory that is at your disposal, the Republic of Cyprus. You have next door Turkey that has said no to you. Remember, in 2003, Turkey said no. If on Huntington's terms, Turkey may have said no because of the so-called kin country syndrome with regard to Iraq. Partly, if you accept the Huntington's thesis, because Turkey is heading in an Islamist direction. Whatever the reason, if Turkey said no, the Republic of Cyprus said yes. Now you would think, that the Republic would have gained some political dividends. They didn't. They were presented with this document that was a travesty. It was procedurally defective, and it was substantively disastrous as well, in my view. And I've written about this in a different context. In fact, what my argument here, this is a very important point I'm going to make. My argument here, and I'll just show you a couple of maps, of course. There's the dodgy dossier map from 2002, which alleged that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction which were capable of reaching British bases in Cyprus and Israel and elsewhere. The point that I'm making to you here is that the Annan Plan was not in Western interests. This was a counter-Western document. It was promoted, as we know, by President Bush and Prime Minister Blair. I don't know whether they read the Annan Plan or whether they just read what was given to them by their officials. But the point is that the Annan Plan was not in Western interests. And I'm going to just draw your attention to one provision of the Annan Plan, which hasn't really attracted much attention. And it's the provision to do with international military operations. Under the Annan Plan, we would have had a Greek Cypriot constituent state and a Turkish Cypriot constituent state operating under the umbrella of a very weak federal government. It beggars belief that under the plan, the Republic of Cyprus, or the UCR, the United Cyprus Republic as it would have been called, would not have been permitted to put its territory at the disposal of international military operations without the support of not just the United Cyprus Republic, but 4 other parties: the Greek Cypriot constituent state, the Turkish Cypriot constituent state, Greece, and Turkey. Now, I'm not the world's leading expert on military strategy, but I'm aware of what Sun Tzu said. Speed is the essence of war. If speed is the essence of war, is it in Western interests for the consent of 5 entities to be obtained before you're able to pass through the airspace of the Republic or make use of its ports or territory or air bases. I cannot understand the mindset of President Bush and Tony Blair back in 2004, why they agreed to this. The British, of course, had the Treaty of Establishment to fall back on in the SPAs, but President Bush didn't have that luxury. And in the event of the Annan Plan going through, the United States would have been left in the position whereby they would have required the consent of Turkey, Greece, and these two constituent states to make use of the Republic of Cyprus. And if one of them said no, the Americans couldn't use the Republic, and they'd be dependent on the British and the SPAs, should they need the SPAs. And as we know from 1973, the British are not guaranteed to always say yes to the Americans. And as we've discovered over the Libya and Lockerbie case over the last few weeks, the British can sometimes upset the Americans in extraordinary circumstances. My point is the Annan Plan was counter-Western. It was a counter-Western document. And beside that narrow strategic point, it would have transformed the Republic of Cyprus into a sort of an apartheid, racially flavoured and racially divided so-called federal republic. So that brings me to the second part of my talk, which is the Crescent crisis and the kaleidoscope of conflict. Let's look at the future, therefore. What is it that the Republic can do to assist the West in this broader region? Now, Chris Belayas has already drawn attention to the article in Time magazine, which first of all drew attention to this phrase, the Crescent crisis. It's been subsequently reported and used in this book that was written by three authors, two of whom now serve in the Obama administration. So it's a phrase I think we need to treat seriously and regard with some degree of respect and care. The Republic is, as we can see, situated, I would put it this way, off the Middle East. It's not really a part of the Middle East. It's now, of course, part of the European Union. But it's beautifully positioned in one sense in order to enable Western forces militarily to gain access to that region. Of course, it's dependent, as far as naval forces are concerned, on the Suez Canal, and as far as air forces, it's dependent upon airspace clearance from other states in the region. But geographically, it's in a beautifully positioned location. But leaving aside the hard military aspects of this, Cyprus is also beautifully positioned in another sense. It's culturally close to this region. The people of this island understand the mindset of the people in the so-called Crescent crisis. There are existing trade links. There are new educational links with the various universities here. The Republic is in a beautiful location to assist the West in dealing with this region on not just the military level, but perhaps more importantly on the soft political and cultural level too. Let me just wrap up over the next 5 minutes or so by just drawing your attention to the 2006 the kaleidoscope of conflict. Let me just refer to the kaleidoscope of conflict. This is a phrase that was coined by General Dannett, who has recently retired as the Chief of the General Staff in the UK. He was rather a politically astute general who was not afraid to speak his mind and upset New Labour politicians. But he offered us a number of thoughtful ideas as regards the future of Western military and political strategy around the world. And according to General Dannett, the West faces two major trends. The first major trend is the threat of, I'm summarising here, is the threat of Al-Qaeda-fueled Islamist extremism. That's the first trend as part of this kaleidoscope of conflict that he refers to. We have a major threat, and it perhaps can be confronted partly with military power, but perhaps more importantly with non-military soft power as well. And the second trend that he refers to focuses on a so-called information campaign. The way in which the world's problems are going to be addressed requires good use of information. And I presume what he means is intelligence gathering at one sense, but also communications, broadcasting, education, the promotion of values in another sense as well. Without putting too fine a point on it, the Republic of Cyprus is beautifully positioned in regard to assisting the West as regards both trends. Let's look at the military aspect from one point of view. We had the Lebanon crisis in July 2006. The Republic hosted, I forget the figures, is it 15,000 American fugitives from Lebanon? Several thousand Brits were evacuated here. The French used the island, the Australians used the island, they used Turkey as well to some extent, but the main thrust of the operations was here. So Cyprus is perfectly positioned to assist in humanitarian and military operations in that sense. But in another sense, the BBC have these transmitters still, I think, at Z. Cyprus is valuable in terms of broadcasting, it's valuable in terms of education, and perhaps more can be done in that regard. Let me now come to my third and final part of my talk. I've tried over the last 40 minutes or so, I'm going to wrap up now, to just explain to you, firstly, how the Republic of Cyprus has progressed from being a pillar of the non-aligned movement into a unique member of the Euro-Atlantic Alliance and of the West. It hasn't joined the NATO alliance, or indeed Partnership for Peace, and as far as I'm aware, it hasn't even made any applications to join. But what it has done is that it's joined the European Union, it's cozied up to the Americans, and it's tried to maintain its friendship with the United Kingdom and other Western players. So there's quite a profound transformation. Today we find ourselves confronting this, as our national security strategy in the UK puts it, this threat of Islamist extremism and terrorism. And we have other problems as well with WMD, which are of a more traditional nature. In fact, this week, before I left England, the newspapers reported this ghastly Crown Court case which involved the conviction of 3 UK-born gentlemen of Pakistani origin who were involved in plotting to blow up, I don't have to say allegedly anymore because they were convicted, they were convicted of plotting to blow up 7 or more airliners flying from the UK over to the United States. It was referred to by the Times as an airline plot to rival 9/11, and the Independent referred to it as potentially Britain's 9/11. But this threat of Islamist extremism is not something that I was a bit sceptical when I started reading about this, but now we're seeing the court cases and the convictions and the evidence that's presented to court. We're beginning to see that this is a genuine and real threat. And it is a threat that the West should treat seriously, and it should act accordingly. The Republic is perfectly positioned to enable the West, if it needs to engage in military operations, to engage in those military operations in areas, and it looks as if this plot had a Pakistani element, in areas to the east where these threats emerge. The problem is that the two leaders here on the island are engaged in a so-called peace process, which in my view is going to, if it succeeds, result in the establishment of a bizonal, bicommunal federation consisting of 2 politically equal communities. It's going to turn this republic into a basket case, which the West will not be able to use properly. Furthermore, as I see it, there is a risk of Islamist extremism entrenching itself in the occupied areas of the north. I've read over the summer that, I may be wrong, perhaps Turkish Cypriots who are here can correct me if I am wrong, but I read that compulsory Quran classes are being introduced in the schools in the occupied area. That's partly the product of the influence of the so-called settlers from Turkey. I also read this week that a cleric in the occupied areas has called for the old part of Nicosia to be transformed into an Islamic canton where Sharia law prevails. Well, are we thinking about these things carefully? Is a bi-communal or bi-communal settlement really going to enable the Republic to remain a Western entity, or is it going to fulfill Huntington's thesis and see a Christian-dominated South and a Muslim-dominated North? Do we really want to have racially and religiously defined zones, a phrase redolent of Germany in the post-war period? Do we really want to have racially and religiously defined zones in the Republic of Cyprus as the future unfolds? Do we really want the Turkey, which is itself militarily progressing in a neo-Ottoman direction and perhaps politically progressing in an Islamist direction, do we want Turkey to maintain a permanent military presence in the Republic of Cyprus or in whatever entity it turns into in the future? Do we want to have that provision that we had back in 2004 with the Annan Plan, whereby Turkey has a veto over how the territory of this place is used? I've put these points in the form of questions so we can maybe discuss them afterwards. But I would argue that the interests of the West are not served by any Annan Plan settlement. And I would go one step further and say that the whole concept of bizonality and bicommunality is alien to the West. It's contrary to Western interests. It undermines Western values, and it ought to be consigned to the dustbin of history together with partition and enosis. If the Republic is to serve the West and to play a role in the West and to help construct bridges into the Crescent crisis, in my view, it needs to be a democratic, unitary, united republic which is stripped of these 1960 arrangements. Which brings me finally to the British. The British have tried to go about things in Cyprus in a rather different way. Whereas Turkey, for example, has used brute force to acquire territory, the British have engaged in this wonderful practice that William Mallinson refers to as Elginism. It's a practice which I refer to in my paper as rather like the practice of acquiring the Elgin marbles, or the Parthenon marbles, which are in the British Museum. Where is my definition? Yeah, here we are. It's been quite a while. Here's my definition of Elginism. It may be described as the peculiarly British process of securing a prima facie legal title over property or territory, but in circumstances which raise awkward questions, if not also the possibility of a legal challenge to the provenance of the title. So the British have this wonderful presence here on the island, through the sovereign base areas and the Treaty of Establishment, which I would argue is Elginistic in its characterisation. But perhaps the Republic ought to think seriously about how to deal with the British presence in the future. Perhaps it should be restructured under a new treaty with different arrangements, which are bilateral rather than quadrilateral, and the British bases are folded into a new security apparatus which protects the interests of the people here more than the interests, or as much as the interests, if not more than the interest of outsiders. And perhaps more broadly, the Republic ought to consider what it is doing in the global security architecture. Should it further engage with the West? Should it apply to the security structures which now exist? Is it going to fulfill its destiny in the Western direction by joining any of those organisations? And I would argue these questions ought to be resolved now, before there's any settlement, not after a settlement has been reached. Because if a settlement is reached, and you have disagreement on something as fundamental as this, you're going to have deadlock, and nothing's going to happen, and the system and the state will atrophy. So I think my time's up, ladies and gentlemen. But I hope I've fulfilled the mission that was given to me by Ray at the outset, and I have been provocative. And I noticed I haven't been arrested yet, which suggests that this place is still a liberal democracy.
If you don't stop, you might be, though.
Thank you.